evening. I'm Brooks Keel, and it is my true pleasure and honor to be the 12th president of the greatest university in the country, Georgia Southern University. I'm delighted we have such a large crowd here tonight to celebrate the life of Martin Luther King. And I'm also glad as a country we don't observe the day for Martin Luther King, but we celebrate the day of this great American. It's my pleasure tonight to be able to introduce our speaker for this celebration, Professor Angela Davis. Through her activism and her scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender equality. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. She spent the last 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and Interdisciplinary PhD program and of Feminist Studies. Angela Davis is the author of 8 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. She has also conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent books are Abolition Democracy and Are Prisons Obsolete? About the abolition of the prison industrial complex, and a new edition of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Angela Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to the educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forward the 21st century abolitionist movement. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Angela Davis.
Dr. Brooks Keel, for the wonderful introduction. I'd also like to thank the Vice President of Student Affairs, Teresa Thompson, the Dean of Students, Greg Lewis, and the Director of the Multicultural Student Center, Consuela Lewis. Thank you very much for having invited me to participate in your commemoration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. And thank all of you for coming out this evening. One of the things I like to do before I begin speaking is to acknowledge the original inhabitants and holders of the land on which we gather this evening. As you heard in the introduction, I spend a lot of time in Australia working with an organization there called Sisters Inside, and whenever we have public events, whenever we come together, we always, before anything else, acknowledge the Aboriginal people who are the original owners of the land. And I think this is a practice we should develop here in this country, given the fact that indigenous people, Native American people, continue to be relegated to invisibility. And in many ways, it is a discursive repetition of the original genocide. So I want us to acknowledge for a moment those who originally inhabited and held the land on which we gather this evening. Now, as someone who was alive and conscious and active during the time Martin Luther King Jr. was working and thinking and acting for justice, I find it almost impossible to believe that more than 4 decades have passed since his assassination in 1968. I can't quite see the entire audience, but those whom I see were probably born in the last 2 decades, or at least the last 3. But as I think back and, on that period, which now we refer to as the Civil Rights era, I always point out that I like to refer to that movement as the freedom movement, civil rights being one aspect of the overarching struggle for freedom. As I think back on that era, what I find utterly amazing is that the words Dr. King spoke then are as relevant today, or perhaps even more relevant today than they were 4 decades ago. This isn't to say that the social and economic and political conditions are the same as they were then. On the contrary, there have been massive, even cosmic transformations. We inhabit today a vastly altered world, much of it directly or indirectly attributable to the determined efforts of Dr. King, other leaders, and the masses of people, many of whose names are now forever irretrievable, with whom he struggled for justice, equality, and peace. Of course, as the slideshow implied, one of the most dramatic changes, which people continue to point to as a navigational point of reference for the 21st century, is the presidency of Barack Obama. Many people responded to his election 2 years ago, and I like to reflect on our historical memory, our historical consciousness, and on the one hand, sometimes it appears as if we have a hard time creating a collective historical consciousness, that is to say, events that, pivotal events that took place 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago are considered to belong to the past. And we don't know how to acknowledge the extent to which we are haunted by history. We are shaped by history. But then on the other hand, oftentimes something that happened just a couple of years ago, we relegate to the past. And if you remember how amazing it was in 2009 when Barack Obama was elected. Do you remember the world historical sense that we all had that something really amazing had happened in the world? And people celebrated all over the country. I'm from Oakland, California, and people were dancing in the street and stopping their cars in the middle of the street to get out and hug people whom they did not know. And people were celebrating in Africa And they were celebrating in Japan in a town called Obama. Now, I think it's important for us to remember how unimaginable the election of Barack Obama appeared to be at one point in history, not very long ago. Now we have a black man in the White House. Some people feel that that means it's not as necessary to reflect on black history, because after all, we've reached Dr. King's mountaintop. But I should say, one of the things Dr. King never did was to say what he saw when he reached the mountaintop. He did not say that he saw a black man in the White House. And even though a black man is in the White House, that does not annul the fact that there are 1 million black men in the big house. So, but shortly, sometime last year, shortly after the election, I was speaking in New York. I was speaking in the city of Buffalo. And preceding me on, in the program was the mayor of New York.